The unmarked police cruiser sat idling in the pre-dawn darkness of a quiet Lexington street, exhaust curling into the frigid April air like ghosts reluctant to fade. Detective Maria Chen gripped the steering wheel with hands that had gone numb sometime during the 2-hour drive from Louisville, staring at the modest ranch house with its neat hedges and the American flag hanging from the porch. 45 years. The man inside that house had lived 45 years of normal life, while Ruth Johnson remained 28 forever, frozen in 1979, buried in a grave her parents visited every Sunday until her father's heart gave out from grief disguised as old age. Chen's partner, Detective Ray Morrison, shifted in the passenger seat and checked his weapon out of habit more than necessity. The arrest warrant tucked inside Chen's jacket pocket felt impossibly heavy for a single piece of paper, but it carried the weight of 4.5 decades of unanswered questions, and in about 3 minutes, when they knocked on that door, everything this neighborhood thought it knew about the Ma N, who lived at 847 Pinewood Drive, was going to shatter like glass. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Cases like this take years of investigation and advanced forensic technology to solve, and your support helps us bring these forgotten stories back into the light. The arrest that morning in April of 2024 would close a case that had haunted Lexington, Kentucky since 1979, a case that had consumed Detective Harold Webb's entire career and followed him into retirement, a case that had devastated a family and left the community forever marked by the senseless loss of one of its brightest lights. Ruth Johnson had been dead for 45 years, but the investigation into who killed her had never truly stopped. It had only waited, patient and persistent, for technology to catch up with truth. And now, finally, impossibly, justice was about to knock on a door in a subdivision where nobody suspected that a monster had been living among them since before most of their children were born, hiding behind a postal worker's uniform and a reputation for being the kind of neighbor who always waved, who always remembered your name, who seemed as ordinary and harmless as anyone you'd ever meet. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how shocking this arrest would be, to grasp the full weight of what Detective Chen was about to do, we need to go back to November of 1979, back to a time when Ruth Johnson was alive and full of plans for a future she'd never see, back to the days when Lexington was a smaller city where people still felt safe, where teachers like Ruth could walk to the corner grocery store on a Sunday evening without fear, where nobody locked their doors because nothing bad ever happened here, or at least that's what everyone believed, until the morning of November 19th, when that illusion died. Ed forever. Ruth Ann Johnson was 28 years old in the fall of 1979, and if you'd asked anyone who knew her to describe her in one word, they'd all say the same thing: kind. She was relentlessly, genuinely, almost impossibly kind in a world that didn't always reward kindness, the sort of person who made you believe that good people actually existed and that maybe humanity wasn't entirely hopeless after all. She taught second grade at Riverside Elementary School on the east side of Lexington. And she wasn't just going through the motions the way some teachers do after a few years when the idealism wears off and the job becomes just a paycheck. Ruth loved teaching the way some people love breathing, like it was fundamental to who she was, like she couldn't imagine doing anything else with her life. Her classroom was organized chaos, colorful and warm and always smelling faintly of crayons and construction paper. She decorated the walls with her students' artwork, every single piece displayed no matter how messy or crooked, because Ruth believed that every child deserved to see their work valued. She kept a jar of lollipops on her desk for kids who were having bad days, and somehow she always knew which kids needed extra attention, which ones came to school hungry, which ones had trouble at home that they were too young to articulate. She stayed late almost every day, helping struggling students with reading or math, never charging for the tutoring, never making the kids feel stupid or less than, just patient and encouraging and absolutely convinced that every child could succeed if someone believed in them enough. The principal at Riverside, a stern woman named Dorothy Hayes who didn't give compliments easily, had told Ruth's parents at a school function that Ruth Johnson was the best teacher she'd had in 20 years of administration. The other teachers adored her because she was never competitive or catty, never complained about workload or difficult parents, always volunteered to take on extra duties, always brought homemade cookies to faculty meetings. The students loved her with that pure, uncomplicated love that children have for adults who genuinely see them and care about them. Years later, long after Ruth was gone, Those students would be adults and they'd still remember Miss Johnson, how she made them feel safe, how she made learning fun, how she was the teacher who changed their lives just by treating them like they mattered. Ruth lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on Elm Street, a quiet, tree-lined road about 3 miles from the school. The apartment was on the second floor of an old converted house. Nothing fancy but clean and cozy in the way that single women in their 20s made spaces cozy in 1979. With houseplants she actually managed to keep alive and framed posters from art museums and a small kitchen where she'd experiment. With recipes from the Better Homes and Gardens cookbook her mother had given her when she moved out. She had a cat named Shakespeare, a massive orange tabby who'd adopted her by showing up at her door one rainy evening and refusing to leave. She talked to Shakespeare while she graded papers, read him passages from the books she was teaching, and he'd sit on her desk purring like he understood every word. But Ruth wasn't going to be living alone much longer. She was engaged to David Martinez, her college sweetheart from the University of Kentucky, where they both graduated in 1973, and they were planning a wedding for the following April, just 5 months away from that November evening when everything would end. David worked as an accountant at a firm downtown, steady and reliable and absolutely devoted to Ruth in that quiet way that doesn't make for dramatic love stories, but makes for solid marriages that last 50 years. They'd been dating since their sophomore year. One of those couples that everyone just assumed would end up together because they fit, because they made each other better, because when you saw them together you couldn't imagine them with anyone else. They picked out a small house in a neighborhood near Ruth's school. Nothing elaborate because teachers and accountants in 1979 Kentucky weren't exactly wealthy, but it had a yard and good bones, and Ruth had already started planning how she'd decorate it, which room would be the nursery when they asked time. Taught at having kids, where she put a desk so she could grade papers while looking out at the garden she wanted to plant. David's parents loved her. Ruth's parents loved David. The wedding invitations were already ordered, sitting in a box in Ruth's apartment closet, cream-colored with elegant script that Ruth had agonized over choosing because she wanted everything to be perfect. Ruth's family was small, but close. Her parents, Thomas and Margaret Johnson, lived in Louisville, about an hour and a half west of Lexington. Thomas worked as a foreman at a manufacturing plant, the kind of man who believed in honest work and providing for his family and never calling in sick even when he probably should have. Margaret was a homemaker who volunteered at their church and kept the most organized household in their neighborhood, where everything had its place and Sunday dinners were sacred family time. They'd raised 2 daughters, Ruth and her younger sister Linda, who was 19 in 1979 and attending community college in Louisville, studying to be a nurse, looking up to her older sister the way younger siblings do when their older sibling is genuinely worth admiring. The Johnsons called Ruth every Sunday evening like clockwork. It was their routine, had been since Ruth moved to Lexington for her teaching job in 1975. Margaret would get on the phone first, and they'd talk about the week, about Ruth's students and wedding plans and whatever was happening in Louisville. Then Thomas would get on, and the conversation would be shorter, more practical, him making sure Ruth's car was running okay, that her apartment was safe, that she was eating properly and not working too hard. Linda would grab the phone last, and they'd gossip about boys and classes and make plans for Linda to visit Lexington in a few weeks. These calls usually lasted about 45 minutes, and they were the highlight of Margaret Johnson's week. Proof that her daughter was happy and healthy and living the life they'd all worked so hard to give her. Sunday, November 18, 1979, was cold for Kentucky in mid-November, the kind of raw chill that cuts through your jacket and makes you want to stay inside with hot coffee and a good book. Ruth had spent most of the day in her apartment grading a stack of spelling tests and planning the Thanksgiving activities she'd do with her class the following week. She called David around noon, and they talked about having dinner together, but David's parents had called with a minor family emergency. His grandmother had fallen and needed someone to drive her to the doctor, so David had apologized and promised. Ruth had told him not to worry, that family came first, that she'd see him Monday after school. Around 6:30 that evening, Ruth realized she was out of milk and bread, staples she needed for breakfast and for the lunches she packed for school. The corner grocery store, a small family-owned place called Morton's Market, was only 3 blocks from her apartment, an easy walk even in the cold. Ruth pulled on her favorite coat, a navy blue wool number with big buttons that her mother had bought her the previous Christmas, grabbed her purse, and headed out. A neighbor, Mrs. Ellen Chen, who lived in the apartment below Ruth's, saw her leaving, and they'd exchanged pleasantries about the weather turning cold, about how Thanksgiving was coming up fast, about how Mrs. Chen was making her famous pumpkin pie for the holiday and would Ruth like the recipe. Ruth had smiled and said she'd love it, that she was trying to expand her cooking skills before the wedding, and Mrs. Chen had laughed and told her that David was a lucky man. Ruth arrived at Morton's Market around 7 p.m., according to the store owner, Frank Morton, who knew Ruth because she shopped there regularly and always chatted with him about his grandkids who were around the same age as her students. She bought milk, bread, a package of sliced turkey, and a box of tea. Frank remembered because he joked with her about stocking up for the cold snap that was supposed to hit later that week. And Ruth had laughed and said she was a Kentucky girl. She could handle a little cold weather. She paid in cash, $4.67, and Frank had watched her leave the store carrying 2 paper bags, heading back toward Elm Street in the gathering darkness of a November evening that felt like it was going to be perfectly ordinary, forgettable, just another Sunday in a small American city where nothing remarkable ever happened. A neighbor named James Whitfield, who lived 2 houses down from Ruth's apartment building, saw her walking back around 7:15. He was taking his trash cans to the curb, and he'd waved, and Ruth had waved back, called out something about the cold weather, and continued toward her building. That was the last confirmed sighting of Ruth Johnson alive. She walked up the exterior stairs to her second-floor apartment, presumably unlocked her door with the key she kept in her coat pocket, went inside with her groceries, and entered the last minutes of her life without any awareness that she wouldn't live to see Monday morning, wouldn't make it to her classroom where 23 second graders would be waiting for Miss Johnson to teach them about Pilgrims and Native Americans and the Thanksgiving story. What happened next would only be reconstructed later through forensic evidence and crime scene analysis. But the basic timeline was clear enough to break your heart if you thought about it too long. Ruth had entered her apartment, set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, and probably started to unpack them. She'd taken off her coat and draped it over a chair. She'd kicked off her shoes, leaving them by the door the way she always did. And then someone had attacked her, someone who was either already in the apartment waiting or who'd followed her inside, someone who brought violence into a space that should have been safe, that was supposed to be Ruth's sanctuary from the world. David Martinez had tried calling Ruth that Sunday evening around 9 p.m., which was unusual for them because they typically talked earlier in the day, but he'd gotten back from helping his grandmother later than expected and wanted to check in, wanted to hear her voice before he went to bed. The phone rang and rang with no answer, which wasn't particularly alarming because Ruth sometimes took long baths on Sunday evenings to relax before the school week, or maybe she'd gone to bed early with a book. David tried again around 10 p.m. with the same result. And now he felt the first stirrings of unease. Nothing concrete, just that instinct you develop when you know someone well enough that their patterns become predictable and deviations feel wrong. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that Ruth was fine, that she'd probably just unplugged the phone because she had a headache or wanted uninterrupted sleep. But sleep didn't come easily for David that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how Ruth always answered the phone when he called, how she'd mentioned earlier that she had no plans for the evening beyond grading papers, how it wasn't like her to be unreachable. By 6 a.m. Monday morning, David was already dressed and heading to his car, telling himself he was being paranoid but unable to shake the growing certainty that something was wrong. He drove to Elm Street as the sun was rising, parked outside Ruth's building, and climbed the exterior stairs to her apartment. He knocked, called her name, waited. Nothing. He tried the doorknob and felt his stomach drop when it turned easily, unlocked. Because Ruth was meticulous about locking her door, she'd grown up with a father who drilled home security into her head since childhood. David pushed the door open and called Ruth's name again, his voice echoing in the small apartment, and the silence that answered him was wrong, was thick and terrible, and absolutely wrong. He stepped inside and saw the grocery bags still on the kitchen counter, items half unpacked, milk that should have been refrigerated sitting out all night, and his heart was racing now, his mind trying to process what he was seeing and not wanting to move forward, not wanting to walk toward the bed. Room where he could see the door was slightly ajar. He called Ruth's name one more time, quieter now, almost a whisper, and when there was still no answer, he moved toward that bedroom door with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, with a growing dread that was trying to prepare him for what he was about to find, even though nothing could have prepared him. Nothing could have made that moment anything less than the worst moment of his life. Ruth was on the bedroom floor beside her bed, And David's brain couldn't initially process what he was seeing, couldn't reconcile the still figure in front of him with Ruth, who was supposed to be getting ready for school, who was supposed to be alive and planning their wedding and teaching second Greer adders about Thanksgiving. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he touched her shoulder, already knowing but unable to accept it, and her skin was cold in a way that told him she'd been gone for hours, that whatever had happened long before he'd even started worrying. David stumbled backward, his breath coming in gasps, and somehow managed to get to the kitchen phone, managed to dial 911 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, managed to tell the dispatcher that something had happened to his fiancée, that she wasn't breathing, that they needed to send someone Emmy. Immediately to 847 Elm Street, apartment 2B. The Lexington Police Department responded within minutes, patrol officers securing the scene and calling for detectives and the medical examiner, and by 8 a.m. the small apartment was swarming with personnel, while David sat outside on the stairs with a blanket someone had draped over his shoulders, answering questions in a monotone voice that didn't sound like his own. Detective Harold Webb arrived around 8:30, a 42-year-old veteran investigator with 15 years on the force and a reputation for thoroughness and persistence. Webb had seen his share of crime scenes, but something about this one hit him differently from the start. Maybe because Ruth Johnson looked so young lying there. Maybe because the apartment was so clearly the home of someone kind and good, someone who didn't deserve whatever had happened here. The initial crime scene processing revealed several crucial facts. Ruth had been attacked shortly after entering her apartment, probably within minutes of arriving home based on the fact that she'd only partially unpacked her groceries. There were signs of a struggle, but nothing that suggested prolonged resistance, which the medical examiner would later explain meant the attack had been swift and brutal, giving Ruth little time to fight back. The apartment hadn't been ransacked. Ruth's purse was on the counter with her wallet still inside, containing $23 untouched. Her small jewelry box on the bedroom dresser hadn't been opened. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, which meant this wasn't a robbery, or if it had started as one, the perpetrator had abandoned that motive quickly. The forensic team collected evidence with meticulous care. They photographed everything from multiple angles, dusted for fingerprints, collected hair and fiber samples, and most importantly, they collected biological evidence that would prove crucial 45 years later, even though in 1979 DNA analysis was still years away from being a standard forensic tool. They bagged Ruth's clothing, preserved samples from underneath her fingernails where she might have scratched her attacker, documented everything according to protocol. Detective Webb supervised it all, making sure nothing was missed, already aware that this case felt different, that the lack of obvious motive meant they were dealing with something more complex than a simple robbery gone wrong. The investigation moved forward with urgency in those first days. Webb interviewed everyone in Ruth's orbit, starting with David Martinez, who became the first suspect because statistics said that when a woman is murdered, look at the husband or boyfriend first. But David's alibi was airtight. He'd been with his parents and grandmother from 5 p.m. Sunday until nearly 9 p.m., with multiple witnesses confirming his presence. His grief was genuine and devastating to witness, and Webb's instincts, honed over 15 years of reading people, told him David Martinez hadn't killed his fiancée. He was simply the man who'd had the misfortune of finding her body and would carry that image for the rest of his life. Webb talked to Ruth's neighbors, none of whom had heard anything suspicious Sunday evening. Mrs. Ebraz, Ellen Chen, who lived directly below Ruth, said she'd been home watching television with her husband and hadn't heard any unusual sounds. No screaming, no sounds of a struggle, nothing that would have indicated violence was occurring one floor above her. Other neighbors reported seeing no unfamiliar vehicles parked on Elm Street that evening. No strangers lurking around the building. Nothing out of the ordinary for a quiet Sunday in a residential neighborhood where people mostly kept to themselves. The investigation expanded to Ruth's workplace. Webb interviewed Principal Dorothy Hayes and Ruth's fellow teachers at Riverside Elementary, all of whom described Ruth in glowing terms and couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt her. There were no disgruntled parents, no conflicts with staff, no inappropriate relationships with anyone connected to the school. Ruth's students were 7 and 8 years old, far too young to be suspects, and their parents all checked out as normal families with no red flags. Webb talked to Frank Morton at the corner grocery store, who confirmed Ruth had been in around 7 p.m. and it seemed perfectly normal, cheerful even, giving no indication she felt threatened or afraid. Ruth's phone records showed nothing unusual. Calls to her parents, to David, to a few friends, to the doctor's office to schedule an appointment, all perfectly ordinary communications. Her bank account revealed no strange transactions, no large withdrawals, no evidence of blackmail or financial distress. Her apartment yielded no threatening letters, no indication that anyone had been stalking her or making her feel unsafe. Ruth Johnson had been, by all evidence, exactly what she appeared to be, a kind young woman living a quiet life, teaching children and planning a wedding, with no enemies and no reason for anyone to want her dead. The forensic evidence was sent to the Kentucky State Police Lab for analysis, but the technology of 1979 was limited. They could type blood samples, could analyze hair and fiber, could lift fingerprints and compare them to known databases, but DNA profiling wouldn't become available for criminal investigations for several more years. The fingerprints collected from Ruth's apartment were run through every database available and produced no matches. The hair and fiber evidence was cataloged, but couldn't be definitively linked to any suspect without someone to compare it to. The biological samples were preserved according to protocol, but without DNA technology, they were just evidence waiting for science to catch up. As November turned to December and then into 1980, the investigation began to slow. Every lead had been followed. Every person in Ruth's life had been interviewed and cleared. Every piece of evidence had been processed and analyzed with 1979 technology. Webb kept working the case, kept looking for the connection he'd missed, the suspect he'd overlooked, but nothing materialized. Ruth's murder began the slow, agonizing process of going cold. The years passed with the peculiar weight that time carries after unsolved tragedy, each November bringing the anniversary of Ruth's death like a wound that never quite healed, just scabbed over enough to let people function until something tore it open again. For Ruth's family, time had fractured into two distinct realities: the world before November 18, 1979, when Ruth was alive and planning her wedding and teaching second graders, and the world after, where they existed in a permanent state of suspended grief, unable to move forward because how? Do you move forward when the person who destroyed your family is still out there, still free, still living their life while your daughter remains 28, forever? Margaret Johnson took Ruth's death the way mothers take the loss of children, which is to say she didn't take it at all. She simply carried it, a weight that became part of her physical being, that aged her faster than time alone could account for. She stopped sleeping through the night, would wake at 3 a.m. and lie in the darkness thinking about Ruth's last moments, wondering if her daughter had been afraid, if she'd suffered. Questions that had no answers but demanded to be asked anyway. She kept Ruth's childhood bedroom exactly as it had been, refused to let Thomas suggest they turn it into something else, and she'd go in there sometimes and sit on the bed surrounded by Ruth's high school yearbooks and teaching certificates and the bridesmaid dress Linda had already picked out for. The wedding that would never happen. Thomas Johnson channeled his grief into anger, into a burning rage at the injustice of it that he carried like fuel, that kept him calling the Lexington Police Department every few months, demanding updates, demanding to know why they hadn't caught whoever did this, demanding justice that seemed easingly unlikely as months turned into years. He'd drive to Lexington sometimes without telling Margaret, would sit in his car outside Ruth's old apartment building just staring at the windows, trying to understand how someone could murder his daughter and vanish like smoke, leave no trail, no explanation, nothing but absence and questions. His co-workers at the plant noticed how he'd changed, how the easy smile he'd once had was gone, replaced by a hardness that made people uncomfortable. His health began to deteriorate, high blood pressure and heart problems that his doctor said were stress-related, but Thomas didn't care about his health. He cared about living long enough to see justice for Ruth, and when that didn't happen, when the years kept passing with no arrests, his body begged Anne to give up the fight. Linda Johnson was 19 when her sister died, still figuring out who she was and what she wanted from life. And Ruth's murder became the defining event that shaped everything that came after. She dropped out of nursing school because she couldn't focus, couldn't sit in lectures about saving lives when her sister's life hadn't been saved, when whoever had taken that life was walking around free. She spiraled for a while, drinking too much, dating men who were wrong for her, angry at the world and at God and at the universe for being so fundamentally unjust. But eventually, with therapy and time and a strength she hadn't known she possessed, Linda found purpose in her pain. She became a victim's advocate, working with families of unsolved homicides, helping them navigate the nightmare of living with unanswered questions, channeling her grief into something that honored Ruth's memory by helping others the way Ruth had always helped people. Every year on November 18th, Linda would drive to Lexington and visit Ruth's grave at Calvary Cemetery on the south side of town. In the early years, there would be crowds, former students of Ruth's and their parents, teachers from Riverside Elementary, neighbors from Elm Street, community members who'd been touched by the story and wanted to show they hadn't forgotten. They'd bring flowers and stand in respectful silence while Linda read a poem or shared a memory, and for a few hours each year it felt like Ruth's death still mattered to people beyond her immediate family. But as the 1980s became the 1990s and then the 2000s, the crowds thinned. People moved away or died or simply moved on with their lives because you can't carry someone else's grief forever when you have your own challenges to face. By the time the 20th anniversary came around in 1999, it was mostly just Linda and her parents, and maybe a handful of others, standing in the cold November air, mourning a woman who'd been gone longer than she'd been alive. Thomas Johnson died in 2003 of a massive heart attack, collapsing at work at age 71, and everyone who knew him understood that he died of a broken heart as much as any physical ailment. He'd never gotten the justice he'd fought for, never learned who killed his daughter, never found peace. At his funeral, Linda stood beside her mother and felt the full weight of being the only one left, the sole keeper of Ruth's memory, the only person still demanding answers when the world had moved on. Margaret aged rapidly after Thomas died, grief compounding grief, and though she lived until 2018, making it to 89 years old, Linda knew her mother had stopped really living decades earlier, had just been going through the motions, waiting to die so she could be with Thomas and Ruth again. Detective Harold Webb retired from the Lexington Police Department in 1995 after 30 years of service, but retirement didn't free him from the cases that had haunted his career, particularly Ruth Johnson's murder. His wife Martha had hoped that leaving the job would mean leaving the darkness behind, that they could finally travel and spend time with grandchildren without Harold disappearing into his thoughts. But she'd known her husband for 40 years and recognized that some cases become part of you in ways you can't explain even to yourself. In his garage, Webb kept boxes of case files he technically shouldn't have, copies he'd made over the years, and Ruth's case occupied the place of honor, spread across a folding table against the back wall like a shrine to unsolved mysteries. On slow afternoons when Martha was out with friends, Webb would spend hours in that garage, putting on his reading glasses and reviewing everything again. The timeline reconstructed on a corkboard with photographs of Ruth smiling in her classroom, the witness statements he'd memorized, the forensic reports with their 1979 limitations that frustrated him because he knew that if this case had happened 10 years later, after DNA analysis became standard, they might have caught the killer immediately. He stayed current on forensic advances, read articles about new techniques, attended conferences even in retirement, convinced that someday technology would evolve enough to crack this case. He thought about Ruth constantly, about the life she should have had, the students she should have taught, the children she should have raised with David Martinez, who'd never married anyone else, who'd carried his own grief into lonely middle age. The case was periodically reviewed by new detectives as departmental policy dictated, once every 5 years or whenever someone transferred into the cold case unit and wanted to prove themselves by solving an old mystery. Each time, the new detective would approach it with fresh eyes and determination, would review the evidence and conduct new interviews, and run the preserved biological samples through whatever databases were available. And each time, they'd hit the same wall Webb had hit in 1979. The DNA profile extracted from evidence at the crime scene was solid, properly preserved, scientifically valid, but running it through CODIS, the national DNA database, produced no matches. Whoever had killed Ruth Johnson either had no criminal record or had committed their crimes before DNA collection became standard practice in arrests. By the time Detective Maria Chen transferred to the Lexington Police Department's cold case unit in 2020, Ruth Johnson's murder had been unsolved for 41 years. Chen was 33 years old, had spent 8 years with the Louisville Police Department, where she'd built a reputation as a meticulous investigator with particular interest in genetic genealogy, the revolutionary technique that had exploded into public consciousness with the 2018 arrest of the Golden State Killer. Chen had followed that case obsessively, had attended training sessions on genetic genealogy, had networked with other investigators who'd successfully used the method to crack cold cases. When she saw Ruth Johnson's file, something clicked. The evidence had been properly preserved. The DNA profile was solid. The original investigation had been thorough. This case was perfect for genetic genealogy. Chen reached out to Linda Johnson in early 2021, introduced herself, explained that she'd taken over Ruth's case and wanted to try something new. Linda was skeptical at first because she'd heard promises before, had watched detectives cycle through her sister's case for 4 decades without results. But something about Chen's confidence and detailed knowledge of genetic genealogy gave her hope she hadn't felt in years. Chen explained that the technique worked by uploading crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, finding distant relatives who shared genetic material with the unknown perpetrator, then building family trees to identify possible suspects. It was painstaking work that combined cutting-edge genetics with old-fashioned genealogical research, but it had solved cases that had been cold for decades. The challenge was funding. Genetic genealogy wasn't cheap, requiring specialized labs and expert consultants, and the Lexington Police Department had limited budget for cold cases, especially one as old as Ruth's. Chen spent months building her case to department brass, preparing presentations with statistics about genetic genealogy success rates, arguing passionately about the department's obligation to Ruth's family and the community. She emphasized that solving this case would demonstrate that Lexington never gave up on its victims, that justice delayed wasn't justice denied, that 41 years didn't matter when you had the right tools. In December 2021, she got approval to proceed. The preserved evidence was sent to Othram Labs in Texas, a company specializing in forensic-grade genome sequencing that had successfully worked numerous cold cases nationwide. The process was slow and technical, extracting DNA from samples that were over 4 decades old, amplifying the genetic material using proprietary techniques, then sequencing the genome to create a profile that could be uploaded to genealogy. Chen checked in weekly for updates, trying to be patient, reminding herself that good forensic work couldn't be rushed. Finally, in September 2022, she got the call she'd been waiting for. Othram had successfully created an enhanced DNA profile suitable for genealogical analysis. They were ready to begin the search. The profile was uploaded to GED Match and Family Tree DNA, databases that permit law enforcement access under specific protocols. Within days, the system identified several matches, distant relatives who shared segments of DNA with Ruth's unknown killer. These weren't close matches, not parents or siblings or even first cousins, but third and fourth and fifth cousins, people separated by 4 or 5 generations who shared common ancestors born sometime in the 1800s. To most people, these would be strangers, relatives so distant you'd never meet them at a family reunion. But to a genetic genealogist, they were breadcrumbs leading back to a family tree that could be built and analyzed and ultimately used to identify a killer who'd evaded justice for 43 years. Chen hired Thomas Brennan, a genetic genealogy consultant who worked multiple successful cold cases, a former librarian who discovered a talent for building family trees while researching his own ancestry. Brennan was methodical and brilliant, the kind of researcher who could spend 12 hours staring at census records and property deeds and marriage certificates and find connections others would miss. He began the painstaking work of identifying the common ancestors shared by the DNA matches, then building out complete family trees showing all descendants. This meant diving into historical records going back to the Civil War era, tracing families through marriages and births and deaths, following surname changes and geographic migrations, assembling a massive genealogical puzzle where each piece was a human life. The work took months. Brennan would send Chen periodic updates, dense reports with hand-drawn family trees showing multiple generations and highlighting individuals who warranted further investigation. By summer of 2023, Brennan had identified 3 family lines that all connected back to central Kentucky in the 1800s. The challenge was narrowing down which descendants from these lines would have been the right age and in the right location to have killed Ruth Johnson in November 1979. The initial list included over 80 male descendants who would have been between 18 and 50 in 1979. Many could be eliminated immediately because they died before 1979 or were living in other states with documentation proving they couldn't have been in Lexington. But that still left dozens of viable candidates who needed investigation. Chen and her team began the delicate process of background checks without alerting their subjects. They pulled DMV records, employment histories, property records, anything public that would tell them where these men had been living in 1979 and whether they had any connection to Lexington or to Ruth Johnson. Most could be eliminated fairly quickly, men who'd moved away decades earlier or who had solid alibis for other reasons. But as they worked through the list through late 2023, one name kept drawing Chen's attention. A man who not only lived in Lexington in 1979 but still lived there now, had never left, had spent his entire life in the city where Ruth Johnson had died. A man whose 1979 address placed him within 2 miles of Elm Street. A man who'd worked as a postal carrier in 1979, whose route, according to old USPS records Chen managed to obtain, had included Elm Street. James Robert Sullivan, born in Lexington in 1956, making him 23 years old in November 1979. Worked for the United States Postal Service from 1977 until his retirement in 2015, a 38-year career delivering mail to the same neighborhoods, including the neighborhood where Ruth Johnson had lived and died. Married in 1983 to Carol Ann Morrison, father of 3 children, grandfather of 7, member of Grace Methodist Church, volunteer at the Lexington Community Food Bank, by every outward measure a pillar of the community, respected and unremarkable, and exactly the kind of person nobody would ever sue. Suspect of murder. Chen felt her pulse quicken as she dug deeper into Sullivan's background. She couldn't move too fast, couldn't get ahead of herself, because family tree analysis and geographic proximity weren't enough for an arrest warrant. She needed direct DNA evidence, a sample from Sullivan that could be compared to the crime scene profile, and she needed to obtain it legally in a way that would hold up in court. Chen knew from other cases that the best approach was collecting abandoned DNA, items discarded in public that were legally considered trash and therefore accessible without a warrant. But that required surveillance, patience, and luck. In March 2024, Chen initiated surveillance on James Sullivan, assigning a rotating team to follow him and wait for an opportunity. They watched him run errands, attend church services, meet friends for coffee, volunteer at the food bank, go about his daily life with no apparent awareness that 45 years after murdering Ruth Johnson, justice was finally closing in. They watched and waited for him to throw away a coffee cup or a water bottle or a napkin, anything with saliva or skin cells that could yield DNA. The break came on March 22nd. Sullivan stopped at a gas station convenience store, purchased a large coffee, and sat in his truck in the parking lot, drinking it while checking his phone. When he finished, he tossed the empty cup in a trash can outside the store entrance and drove away. The surveillance team waited 15 minutes to be safe, then retrieved the cup, carefully bagging it as evidence and maintaining chain of custody. The cup was rushed to the Kentucky State Police lab with urgent priority. Chen felt hope and dread in equal measure. This was it. Either the DNA would match and they'd have Ruth's killer after 45 years, or it wouldn't and they'd be back to square one. The lab results came back on April 8, 2024. Chen was at her desk when the call came, and she actually had to ask the forensic scientist to repeat himself because she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from Ruth Johnson's crime scene. Not a familial match suggesting a relative, but a direct match, definitive and irrefutable. They had their killer. After 45 years, after thousands of hours of investigation, after technological advances in genetic genealogy and surveillance and patience that seemed endless, they finally knew who had murdered Ruth Johnson. Chen sat at her desk staring at the lab report, feeling the weight of 45 years compress into this single moment of certainty, and she knew that everything was about to change. For Linda Johnson, who'd spent her entire adult life demanding justice, for the community that had never quite felt safe after Ruth's murder, and for James Robert Sullivan, whose normal life was about to end the moment Chen showed up at his door with an arrest warrant and the undeniable truth that DNA never lies and time never erases what you've done, no matter how well you hide behind respectability and routine.